أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to everyone who is joining us online. Alhamdulillah, this is the 10th episode of the Friday Shutdown, and today we've got a very, very important topic we're going to talk about. Alhamdulillah, we're joined by our brother Ayo, who is a medical student at UCL, and he's also the VP of Student Affairs at FOSIS, which means he overlooks political issues pertaining to Muslim students. Assalamu alaikum, akhi Ayo. How are you?
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing well, bro. Jazakallah khair for having me on here. I'm happy to have this opportunity and this platform to speak to people. And inshallah, I'm able to do this issue on this topic justice.
Inshallah. So yeah, it's a very unique time. We've got coronavirus and all the sort of unique challenges and the situation that's placed us in, and then suddenly this all of the events that unfolded over the last couple of days, the last week or so, has sort of doubled the weirdness of this time. So how are you feeling right now? Like how have you been feeling over the past few days with everything that's going on?
I'll be honest with you, bro. It's been tough. I think just to see everything happening on social media, to be honest, it's been a lot to take in. And I feel like when you're in a position of leadership, because you have to spend a lot more time acting, you can't really always think on the events that are going on. So I think, I've been in quite sort of like switched on sort of go mode, trying to get things done, make sure that people feel like they're being heard and cared for. But for myself, I'll be lying to you if I wouldn't say it's been, it has been a stressful time in that sense. But I'm within these sort of times, I think it's very important just to rely on Allah, and remember, and this is for everybody, it's very important to remember that Allah is Al-Hakam, like He is the giver of justice, the judge. He is going to give us the justice. We can do stuff, but Allah is the one that has the power. So that's what I'm trying to keep in my head anyway, just to keep myself afloat, basically.
Yeah, subhanAllah. It's a very, very unique and difficult time for a lot of people, because obviously this isn't something new. It's not something that's just happening now that everyone's just realized. It's something that's been happening for a long, long time.
Yeah. And
it's just exposed sort of this like underbelly of like our society and everything that's been happening sort of under the surface. Okay, I think we should just sort of get into it. I think I wanted to start with sort of a quick sort of exercise, just throw some phrases at you, see what your responses are to them.
Sure.
So what does it mean to be black?
Okay, just before I start, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum to everybody watching. Just before I start, I will say, if you are watching, it is really important that you watch from the beginning to the end, just because the way my points are going to be structured, and what I'm saying is structured. It's going to be structured in a certain way. So please listen from the beginning to the end, just so you get the full gist of what I'm trying to say, inshallah. What does it mean to be black? This is a very important question, because as a Muslim, I've had people ask me, why is it black Muslim and not African Muslim or Caribbean Muslim? And I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding or a lack of knowledge as to what black means. And I think before we even start this whole discussion on George Floyd, police brutality, all these sorts of things, we need to understand the concept, the central concept of trying to build this topic on, right? So first of all, a lot of the people watching probably from Asian and Arab backgrounds, right? Some of you may be first generation, second generation, third generation. And because of that, you will still have some sort of link to your ancestral sort of roots, whether it be Bangladesh, Pakistan, Palestine, Jordan, wherever it may be, you've still got that sort of link, right? What you'll find with a lot of communities in the UK and the US who come under the term black, right? Originally, a lot of them are from the Caribbean, Africa, West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, South Africa. A lot of them, because of slavery, and this is really important, because of slavery, they have been essentially spread out all over the world, right? So slavery lasted sort of 400 years. Most of the slaves you find actually were sent to South America, namely Brazil, but all over South America. Then North America, namely the United States. There was also a lot of slaves in the UK. I think there are about 850,000 slaves, black slaves in the UK brought from the African continent, West Africa, namely. There was about 43,000 slave masters in the UK. So the UK, you know, there was a lot of slavery going on here, even though you won't see it taught in the textbooks. And even, you know, South Asia, there were slaves sent there, all over Europe, all over the world, right? What does that do to a set of people who are in a community, you know, and are then spread out so far? It means that there are so many different experiences. Yes, those people, you know, even the black people in the Caribbean, most of them actually come from the African continent, West Africa, South Africa, that sort of area. But when people are so disseminated throughout the world, the experience really begins to differ. And what you find is that black is a term which helps people from, you know, the African continent, especially sort of black people, or people will be characterized as black, helps them come together and unite. A lot of them are fourth generation, fifth generation, sixth generation, to the point that they didn't even have that connection to their ancestral, you know, home, their sort of their cultural roots. So black is sort of it's basically a new type of culture for them that brings them together. I think another point is as well is that, you know, black is an articulation, you know, of their experience in the West. So whether it be America, the UK, you know, here I'm looked at as black, right? But when I go back to Nigeria, which is where I'm from, the Nigerians are also black, right? So they're not going to look at me as, oh, it's another black person. They're going to look at me as, oh, this is a Yoruba, which is my ethnic group or tribe. So it really does shift. Black is an articulation of also how people who are seen as black are treated. You know, when people look at me, they see my skin color, you know, that's one of the first things they see. So just to give you an idea, it's actually, it's a way for people to come together, unite. It's something they affiliate to more than maybe their, you know, nationality or their sort of culture, ancestral culture. Whereas Asians and Arabs, and, you know, I think some people may still have that fourth, fifth, sixth generation, you know, they may not feel that connection, but I think the black community is very, very prominent. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting sort of perspective, just how the black experience is different based on your connection to your roots have been sort of severed by the experiences that you faced because of obviously slavery and everything else that happened. Okay, next sort of phrase, racism. What does that mean to you?
I think this is an interesting one. Obviously, this is one I think, you know, is posted on social media a lot. It's used in conversation a lot. I don't want to go too much into where the word came from and things like that. But I think generally, you know, people, I want to explain it in this way, right? If we see racism, there's two main ways I sort of see people go about speaking about it. So people either say racism is from one race to another. So a white person racist to a black person could be racist to a white person, right? Now, I think what's important is to understand how racism came to be about, or how it became more prominent, at least. When you look at the development of the concept of racism, right, it came from people you could call social influencers. I think that's the best way to describe them. You know, like you go on Instagram, when you go on Facebook, Twitter, you've got your people who put out their views and people latch onto those views. They get a lot of retweets and likes, right? They get a lot of coverage. The same way back, you know, 400 or 500 years ago, even 200 years ago, 100 years ago, yes, there was no social media, but you still had social influencers, right? So you had people who had views. They tended to be philosophers, thinkers, scientists, you know, all these sort of names, professors at universities. And what you find is when you look at their writing, what the things they wrote, you know, I'll give you some examples. Charles Darwin was one of these people. Immanuel Kant is one of these people. Francis Galton is another. Arthur de Gobineau, a French thinker. When you actually look at what they wrote, they did this thing where they classified people into races, right? With sort of the whites at the top, and then according to your skin color, you sort of go down the pecking order with the blacks at the bottom. When you look at what they wrote very disturbing and disgusting things about black people. And it's things like, you know, they're stupid, they're half-witted, they don't have brains, you know, they've got a predisposition to criminality, you know, they're thugs, they're criminals. This is a lot of the language we see today. So these guys, you know, who were in their sort of, you know, upper class, middle class sort of fields, that language, those thoughts trickle down. Just like you see today, if a social influencer on Instagram says something is popular, you know, they've got 600,000 followers. You know, people latch onto that stuff. It's the same, that same stuff happened hundreds of years ago, but it's still carried on today. you know, because it became a cycle of perpetuation. You know, the generation that came after took on those thoughts of the generation before. And I think that's how we've gotten to this place today. So that's how we've gotten here. Now, just going back to my sort of two conceptions of what people think racism is. Some people say it's from one race to another, whether you're black, white, whatever. Others say that, you know, it's about power. So, you know, a black person can't be racist to a white person. Why? Because black people aren't in positions of power around the world. You know, the global order is that generally the Western whites are in power. So those are the two ways of thinking about it. I'll introduce a third way, right? And this prominent sort of Islamic thinker on this issue brought this. He said, you know, the first way, in terms of thinking about it, is from one to another. You know, structurally, it doesn't really make so much sense. The second way, yes, the power structure, it makes a lot more sense to a lot of people. But if we think about the third way, this is what the thinker introduced. You know, Iblis, right? Shaitan, Satan, for those who are watching, you know, he whispers in our ears, right? He whispers problematic things, bad things. These can be racist things in terms of ways of thinking. He doesn't have power over us, right? But he has, we then choose to take on. That's the influence he has. We make the conscious choice over whether we internalize those views, right, and take them on. So there's sort of many different ways of thinking about it. You can get the sort of, you know, usually I find a white person, a black person that can be racist to a white person sort of argument is generally found within the white community. And then the power, racism is about power, is generally found within activist groups and community groups and stuff. Although, you know, this is just general, by the way. The third sort of paradigm, the Islamic paradigm of thinking about things, is that it doesn't necessarily negate either one, right? But it just says that just be careful about saying it's all about power, because Iblis, we know Iblis is always whispering things. We as individuals consciously choose to take on those things, right? So it's important to think about that way. I think definitely there is some truth. I definitely would lean a lot to the fact that it is about power, because, you know, when you look at you know, the employment system, when you look at the policing system, it discriminates, and you need power to discriminate through those systems, employment, policing. So I just want to make that clear. Yeah.
It's also probably that that level of racism is the type that has the most direct impact on people's lives. Like, obviously you can probably you know, seek to be that way, but if you don't have the power, then it's a very different situation.
Exactly. And I mean, look,
and you have the will.
People can discriminate from one group to another, right? But if you don't have power to sort of enforce that discrimination, you know, when you have the power to do it, it takes it up a level in notches of what effect that can actually have on masses of groups of people. So
speaking of power, a lot of the response that we often see from people in sort of in what you'd call the status quo, they tend to ask the question, don't all lives matter? So obviously the movement now is very much focused on the fact that it's majority black men being killed, being murdered in the streets in America. But the response is all lives matter. What would you say to that?
I mean, it's one of those things I see so often, and I'm kind of like, you know, I understand people at different levels of understanding, but we've had this conversation quite a few times. But I do understand that people are at different levels of come to terms with these things. But it's one of those things where, at the moment, we're speaking about one issue, and people are frustrated, rightfully so, by the way. People are angry, rightfully so. And to come and then say, you know, instead of focusing on this issue, we're going to widen it out. You know, this is an issue that needs focus. You know, if you're dealing with something, you know, you need to look at the specifics in order to understand how to solve it. If you widen it out, widen the scope out too far, you're not going to be able to solve the issue. Plus, all lives aren't going to matter until Black Lives Matter, right? You see what I'm saying? And right now they don't, because systematically, through police brutality, we're seeing that Black people are being disproportionately killed. So you know, I think some people think it's quite a revolutionary statement to say all lives matter. Yes, they should ideally, but right now, within that all lives matter bracket, Black people don't matter right now to those who have power, and to those who don't have, who are not in power structures. And I think, you know, within the Muslim community as well, there have been some people who have said, okay, what about Palestine? What about the Uyghur Muslims or Rohingya? These are valid issues. Wallah, these are issues that are close to my heart. Valid issues. But let's say we were talking, let's say someone, one of you who's watching, you spent 15 minutes talking about an issue to somebody you're very passionate about, bringing awareness, talking about it, really trying to engage with that person. And they said, oh, I see, but what about this issue? Why are we not talking about that? And you've just poured out your heart, you've spoken about it, you're trying to bring attention to it, you're trying to solve it, you're trying to get them on board. And they say, what about this issue instead? We need to look at things, and we need to remember that if we really want to look at an issue, we need to focus on it. Right now, the focus is on Black Lives Matter, right? It's on police brutality against Black people, injustice against Black people. We can have other conversations later about other causes. And to be honest, throughout the year, we're often talking about, Palestine, Syria, and those things. And again, I think that is very, very important. I'm not saying we shift out those conversations out of things, not at all. I'm saying the conversation about injustices towards Black people, it needs to come higher up on the list, because at the moment it isn't, and we can't detract attention from that when we're speaking about it. I think, I don't think that should be controversial. Honestly, I don't. And just going back to the All Lives Matter statement, I think I've seen like some people, the way they outlet during these times is through memes. It's like, somebody is protesting or raising awareness about, let's say, colon cancer, like stomach cancer, right? And someone's like, oh, why don't we talk about all cancers? Or someone's saying, oh, there's an issue with whales being killed. And someone's like, why do we talk about all animals? When you look at it from that scope, you're kind of like, or there's another one I saw, which is a pretty good one. Somebody's broken their leg, right? And then someone's like, call an ambulance to another person who hasn't broken their leg. And they're like, what about my leg? Do you get what I'm saying? It's just kind of like, we're focusing on one issue now. Let's do that. It doesn't mean we don't talk about other issues, but we're focusing here. So,
I feel like a lot of that kind of response is quite disingenuous, because sort of pointing at things which in a normal circumstance you wouldn't, and especially if it was something that was affecting you.
Like
look at the response to coronavirus, that the threat of the most vulnerable people across all of society dying elicited such a massive response that it's going to affect everyone's lives. All these freedoms that people have been crying out about, have been taken away, at least temporarily, and people don't seem to care. An issue we were talking about previously was that, face coverings are now from the 15th of June or whatever going to be compulsory in London. And in our context, we saw so much issue all about security and being able to recognize people when we were talking about niqab, but suddenly there's no issue indefinitely having people wearing face masks all over London. So it's this sort of selective, not outrage, but selective focus on these issues only when it's not affecting you, when it's affecting people who aren't being given that voice, which is sort of the problem.
And what? So just to add on, I think it's important, to try and assume the best of people, but it becomes particularly hard when this is a cycle of something that keeps happening. Especially, I want to be able to assume the best of people when it comes to these things, but when people because maybe for some people this is just the thing that's come up, this whole issue happening, but for Black Muslims within the community, this is something that's been repeated, which is maybe why you've seen certain people come across quite frustrated, annoyed, upset. There's been a whole sort of build up before this. It's not just today we decided to be like this, if that makes sense. So
yeah, talking about on that point, like that this is the latest in a long line of violence against Black people in America. It's been happening for hundreds of years now, and even just in the last couple of months, there's been a number of like sort of killings of Black people, and none of them elicited the kind of response that we saw for the murder of George Floyd. So why do you think that that specific killing caused such a massive response?
Okay, that's a good question. I think there's been a build-up, right? So I think there was Ahmed Aubrey, who died when he was jogging. Those two guys shot him down while he was jogging. That happened. There was another killing of somebody else around the same sort of time. And generally, there's always videos circulating of police brutality, right? I think there's a few factors as to why this one just set things off. Like, I think the fact, for 9 minutes, this police officer had his knee on George Floyd's neck. And for 2 minutes of those 9 minutes, George Floyd was unconscious. And, the visual effect that can have on one's mind, right? One's soul, one's heart. I think the visual effect that can have, I think it just sparked people. Also, there's the lockdown going on. A lot of people, especially black people, because black people statistically are more likely to sort of live in poorer housing, face socioeconomic deprivation, so not have as much money, have to rely on food banks. People are hungry, people are not living in good conditions. The government is not providing much for them. We've got Trump in power as well, who said openly racist things, either openly or secretly, and has antagonized the black community in different ways. This, I think all of this just had its effect, the lockdown frustration, the political situation with Trump in the US, and then the sort of build up of deaths, and the visual effect of witnessing all of that, seeing all of that. I think it just set people off, and they were like, no, we have to, regardless of whether coronavirus is happening, we have to go out there. And I think, the fact people went out to protest when it's been proven that coronavirus disproportionately affects people, from sort of ethnic minority backgrounds, especially black people within that as well. It must have really, people must have really been angry to want to go out there, So I think it's important we consider that.
I mean, people were definitely angry at the kind of
Yeah.
images we've seen from America. Just, I think what I saw somewhere, this is like the largest protest ever across all 50 states, and across the world now. We've had protests in London too. So, like, what do you think is going to happen? Like, what are your feelings about what happens now from all of this? Because I know we might not have seen this level, like this scale before, but we've seen similar things happen in the past, like when Trayvon Martin was killed in America. There were protests, there was anger, there was, people in power saying this has got to change.
Yeah.
And 8 years since then, nothing much seems to have changed. So, like, what should we expect from this?
I think there are always going to be two different types of changes, in my opinion: measurable changes and immeasurable changes. So generally, from a protest, I think you get a mixture of both. Measurable in that, okay, what are we going to sort of plan after this? What direction are we going in? How are we going to organize? How are we going to bring people together? We don't just protest and then everybody goes their separate ways. Let's get people together who are on the same page and do something. You could see that as being something measurable. Immeasurable, on the other hand, is somebody could speak at a protest or at an event, or on something virtual, and their words penetrate somebody's consciousness so deeply that it sensitizes them to the issue so on such a deep level that they now say, okay, I'm now going to start affecting change. I'm going to start organizing. I'm going to start doing that. So I don't particularly know how we're going to go from here, to be honest. Allahu Alam, as to what's going to happen with that. But I think within this short-term situation with George Floyd, what we've seen is that, the protests did turn to riots. We're being very honest, right? They did turn to riots. What we have seen, though, is that, through this, there have been, they ended up arresting the officer. He was on third-degree murder. They then upgraded into second-degree murder as the riots continued. The 3 or 4 officers that were also watching and standing by, they've arrested them as well. So that happened as the protesting and the rioting was beginning. I know a lot of you have been seeing looting and different bits of violence. I'll be honest with you, within our summit perspective, I don't think that's something we, should be endorsing in that sense. But would I come out and outwardly condemn it right now? I wouldn't. And I'll be honest with you why. Just because tensions are very high, right? Sometimes you really need to think, when tensions are high, when emotions are high and people are frustrated, you may have a very valid critique, but you need to think about whether that critique is going to be helpful at this time towards the issue. There's a time and a place, and there's also, again, some of you who are from Arab and Asian backgrounds or other backgrounds which don't come under black, you may have your opinions on a lot of things. I'm not telling you to not have an opinion, but when I think pushing an opinion to people in the black community, especially when tensions are high, I think just ask yourself, am I best placed to speak on this issue, because it's not my experience. Again, it's not saying don't have an opinion. I can't tell you to not formulate an opinion. That's not my place to do so. But to push your opinion towards another community at a time when tensions are high and it's not your experience, I think it's just thinking about, is this the right time, place? Am I saying the right things? Am I phrasing it? Am I acknowledging my whole positionality within all of this? I think we have to be careful in that, basically what I'm saying.
I think we're uniquely at this time bad at doing that. People are
Yeah,
really
yeah,
used to just coming
yeah.
up and
Just to add one
posting the
more thing,
first thought they
sorry.
have.
Just to add one more thing, sorry, bro. I think, you know, on the looting and the rioting thing, I think, you know, it's not, again, I'm not here to be saying that was definitely the right thing to do, right? But my focus is that people wouldn't have gotten to the point where they're looting and rioting if that, because people did peaceful protests, by the way. You know, there's been a lot of marches. You know, Colin Kaepernick, who was an American football player, he used to take a knee during the American national anthem before games. They kicked him out of his team. You know, he hasn't been working since. He hasn't been playing football since. A lot of people condemned him. This is a large profile figure who was peacefully protesting, and the black community has been peacefully protesting for a long time. And so it got to a point where people said, how can I watch someone from our community, and this is just a long, you know, one person, a long line of many, and not do anything? And I think you just need to understand the frustration that is there. And I'm feeling it, to be honest with you. I'm feeling it. I'm feeling that frustration, but it's felt throughout many, if not most, of the black community right now. You know, almost all of them, that frustration. So, and I think, you know, if people are facing violence, whether it be from the state or an individual, they should be able to defend themselves. It doesn't mean you go out and destroy things, no, but the self-defense, I think, is very important, you know, that we shouldn't shy away from that. So
Yeah, definitely. It's not as if, you know, there's peaceful protests happening on both sides. It's violence on one side, and the expectation is that there will be peaceful protest on the other side.
yeah,
It's a bit of an unfair expectation to expect people who've been sort of downtrodden and basically like murdered in the streets, basically, which is what
yeah,
we've been
yeah,
seeing.
yeah.
To
Well, it's hard. It's
to
hard.
just take it and, you know, turn the other cheek. And
Yeah,
Islam is not
yeah,
teaching us that either.
no, exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
it's a very difficult one, obviously, because
But even within Islam, it's important because we don't want to transgress limits as well. You know, I think I commented on social media because a lot of people are sharing Malcolm X's videos, and I'll talk on him a little bit later, where he says by any means necessary, right? If you study Malcolm X's life, that was something he particularly said in his Nation of Islam days before he went to Mecca. We need to be careful about, you know, the actions we take, because, you know, within, and this is wider than this issue now, you know, when you take certain actions that cross your principles, you know, our Islamic principles, our limits, you know, you can actually become a person that is unrecognizable from who you started off. You know, you could have started off with a very righteous anger and justice. By the time you get to the end, the, you know, sort of contorted form of justice you're following now is going to be, it's not going to be justice at all. So it's a difficult conundrum, right? Because we need to think when we're doing these things. I'm not to say the people out there aren't thinking, but, you know, it's yeah, that's all I can say. It's difficult.
It just highlights how important having and using our Islam in times like this is so important. Because coming back to something we know is the solution, coming back to a framework which we know will be the solution. You see so many people, so many movements start very well meaning, and 50 years after they started, 100 years after they start, they go off and become something unrecognizable because they're grounded in something that's constantly changing, that's affected by emotion, by anger, by you know, all of those sorts of things. So it's really important as Muslims who are affected by this. Many Muslims are affected by this all over the world, not just in America. That we respond to it in the way that our Islam teaches us to, because that's the best response that we can have at this moment.
Yeah, 100% agree, bro.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, bro, what, like, obviously this is all happening in America, and a lot of people struggle to see parallels in the UK. You know, some of the things you hear, sort of like racism in the UK isn't as bad, or it's more subtle, or it's not the same as in America. What has your sort of personal experience growing up as a young black Muslim in the UK been?
Definitely. I think so. First of all, I just want to say, me talking about my experiences, this is not about me, by the way. It's about the wider black community. It's about George Ford, about his family and all the other victims of police brutality. But I just hope through going through my experience, I can bring some of these things to life. For those of you who maybe know me indirectly or directly. I think I'm just wondering where to start. I mean, as I said, I've felt this issue quite viscerally, even though I maybe haven't expressed it online. I don't really believe about don't believe in expressing my my anguish, basically my grief online. I don't think that's not something I like to do anyway. But I will sort of open up with all of you and say, when looking at this issue, I definitely wept. I was just, I went for a drive the other day just to relax myself, and I just stopped and I just found myself weeping. And I was thinking about why, and I was like, because these things that we witness affect our psyche, they affect our mind so deeply. They affect the Black community's mind so deeply because these are things we can relate to. I grew up on a council estate in Bermondsey, and there's a sort of the Millwall Football Club is quite predominant around there. They're quite close. My mum, when she first came to this country in the 90s, they sprayed on her door, go back to Africa, you black monkey. That's a long line of things that's happened. That's from people, right? People in the area. When I used to walk up and down that community, I remember a time when I was actually just walking, and police, they literally banged on, they were driving like, they banged on the door, and they just started taunting me and doing all these faces and stuff. And I was like, why? Another thing that happened is I've been harassed by police in a sense of stop and search. So I remember I was with 4 other black medical students, like passing through an area. There were police posted at the area. It's quite busy period. Then they said, oh yeah, we're just stopping everybody in the area, please just stop and search. And I was like, okay, and I was like, do I have to? And they were like, yeah, you do. So I was like, okay, search me. These guys didn't even know we were medical students, like they don't know anything about us. And even if we weren't, that doesn't mean you should, just because you look at me, that you should search me. The thing that really hit home for me was that when they were searching us, they said they're stopping everybody in the area, right? So I was like, okay. I think there was about 3-4 white guys who were passing and laughing. Bro, voila, they passed and they weren't searched. And that just really, when you just like smile to yourself a little bit, I didn't even I couldn't, and that time I wasn't really too active on these issues. So I didn't really have too much to say, but I just felt like, it just felt like a reinforcement of, yeah, you're lower than. Even yesterday, bro, this happened to my parents. Yesterday, they were driving along a place, and there's, when you get those temporary sort of stoplight sort of things,
Yeah.
they were sort of diverted and stopped there. 2 ticket people came and started shouting at them like, move from here, move from here, move from here. 2 white ticket people. So they were being really rude, really, really rude. I'm not going to repeat what they were saying. My parents came out of the car to speak to them. My mum, the white lady, then started shouting, why are you coming near me? Don't come near me, don't come near me. And everybody started looking, and my mum was like, I'm not doing anything. I'm just walking towards you. And then my dad as well sort of came out, and the other guy was like, why are you being dangerous? Why are you being dangerous? And I can't even, you know what I'm saying? Like, I literally heard about this today, by the way, because I wasn't with them. And it just made me really sit and pause. And it's just like, it's just everywhere. Like, this mindset is everywhere, right? People have whether you're young, old, whatever, there's this, people thought, they were basically saying my parents were going to be violent to them. Why are you being dangerous? Why are you coming near me? And she started running away, and she was my mom was walking towards her, literally walking towards her. And this, some people get stopped and searched hundreds of times, by the way, just because of the way they look. Whether you work in the city, you could be wearing a suit. When you come through a certain area, hundreds of times, tens of times. Why? Because of skin color. Because we're black. Why? And it goes back to those social influences of the, back at hundreds of years ago, tens of years ago, who were pushing out this thing of they're thuggish, they're barbaric, they're criminal. It has pervaded till today, to the point where, people in power, whether it be, the ticket officers gave a ticket for them parking on a yellow line, and there was no yellow line. Like, subhanAllah, like, and I actually just want to go.
We can all agree to hate ticket officers.
Pardon, sorry?
I think we can all agree that we don't like ticket officers. So.
Yeah. No, you don't. No, you don't. No, you don't. Alhamdulillah. What was I going to say? Even I actually want to touch on the Black Muslim community as well, because I have I faced comments, whether it be in the masajid or in the community, from brothers a lot of people watching, I'm sure you do it for jokes, and in your mind it seems as banter, but it really isn't. And it is very hurtful to people when, for example, you joke about black people being criminals or thugs, or using the N word is another one. You know, I think that's something that needs to be avoided, right? You know, but in my experience, you know, I have had, you know, whether it be on a group chat or as a joke towards me, maybe some brothers compare black people to monkeys. You know, um, I've had people, you know, I am a revert, by the way. I'll just put out there, I'm a revert, but there's large amounts of the black community who aren't reverts, by the way. Nigeria, where I'm originally from, um, probably sixth, seventh most populated country in the world, 200 million people. Half of those are Muslims, born Muslims, by the way. Um, if you look at other countries in West Africa, um, Senegal, Gambia, you know, Sierra Leone, either have like ranging from 75 to 95% Muslim. You know, you go to Uganda, which is in Southeast Africa, I believe. They don't have predominantly Muslim, but they've got, you know, a large Muslim population, like significant 30-40%. East Africa, you've got Somalia, Eritrea. They, you know, Somalia is basically all Muslim, or you've got Eritrea where there's, I'm not sure about the percentage, but there's definitely a high percentage of Muslims there. So people need to realize that, you know, like sometimes I've had people questioning, am I a Muslim? Like I've been outside, maybe prayer room, for example, and that's been asked of me. I could have been coming out and it's like, oh, bro, are you Muslim? And it's like, I don't think they would have asked of the other brothers coming out the room. You know, even if I'm saying Assalamu alaikum, come on, guys. I'm not saying it for fun. You know what I'm saying? And again, I don't always think it's malicious. Sometimes I think it's ignorance and it's unconscious, but sometimes, I'll be honest, sometimes there is a bit of malice there.
Yeah, because I was gonna ask about that, because obviously a lot of these sorts of incidents, they're sort of those like micro level stuff that maybe the people doing it don't even realize that they're doing it. Might be that uncle in the mosque who's just asked you if you know if you know where you are, or if you're a reaver, or if you're, because he, in his experience, he just doesn't see, like in his mind, a Muslim isn't that in his head. It's not necessarily that he's got this ill feeling towards you, anything like that. So do you think it's important that we recognize that a lot of this stems from ignorance, and how do we tackle that ignorance amongst our own community, amongst the Muslims themselves?
So I think it's difficult, right? I'm not gonna tell you here and say how much of it is ignorance and unconscious, how much of it is conscious and malicious. Allahu alam as to that, right? My thing is, first of all, our solutions, I think, is very, very important. Our solutions are rooted in Islam, and I'll explain why. Solutions from other sort of places, yes, they may have certain aspects in them which are useful and work, but why we've already had the solutions within Islam that are placed there, right? So everybody knows that the fact that the Prophet ﷺ, within his last sermon talked about how there is no a non-Arab doesn't have superiority over an Arab, and vice versa. A black man doesn't have superiority over a white man, and vice versa. The only person who has superiority, I'm paraphrasing here, is basically those who are pious. And I think it's interesting because someone who's pious doesn't even look at who's higher, who's better than who, right? They ignore that stuff. But talking about issues of race and ethnicity, and racism, basically, the Prophet ﷺ, he addressed this in his last sermon. I think that's so significant, and also just for people watching, whether you're Muslim or not, right? The fact that this was spoken about 1400 years ago, I think is very, very big statement. Islam was ahead of the game at that time, and I still think it is ahead of the game in the solutions it offers. I think what we now need to do is to bring these sayings of the Prophet ﷺ to life, right? There's another Surah An-Nisa, verse 135. O you who have believed, be persistently standing firm in justice, witnesses for Allah, even if it be against yourselves, your parents and relatives. So this thing of justice is embedded in our faith, right? Whether you're whether it's unconscious or conscious, one needs to look inside themselves and have some introspection and really look at, do I have these sentiments? Even from listening to this and listening to other things, And, I think a very important principle that I try and apply to myself, regardless of how somebody puts forward their criticism or their issue. Of course, I prefer it if people put it in a way which is more digestible for me, or in a way which is nicer. Like, basically, people aren't always going to be able to do that just because of frustrations and different things. You can make the difference in that. Whenever they put something towards you, just actively listen. Just actively listen and listen to what they have to say. And even if it's put forward in a way which you don't like, or is harsh, or it comes across harsh, right? Just think about what actually led them to having these sentiments. Why are they so, why is it something that touches them so deeply? Like, I want to understand that. You know, try and actively listen, just to get a better idea of why this is going on, and pick from that. However people put things forward, there may still be some truth in that which you can extrapolate. Take that. And in terms of, I really think if we start solving these issues, looking at it within ourselves, having conversations with our family members, something I'm going to come on to, I think those sentiments and anger, the frustration, the annoyance with the rest of the community coming from Black Muslims, inshallah, I really do hope it will decrease. Just looking at your parents now. Let's be honest. A lot of people say you've got to call out your family, and I've spoken on this before. I think it's a very difficult thing to do. I know. Just take myself aside from this issue. I know if I was to speak to my mum and sort of be like, "Mum, why did you do that? Oh, that's wrong." She's probably gonna give me a, what are you doing? Like, she's not gonna respond well to that. But I think, use some tactics. Maybe you clean the house. Maybe you do some chores. Do something they like. Make them some food. When they're in a good mood, approach them. Have some general conversation. Start to edge towards this. And obviously, look, they're our parents. We have to hold those ties of kinship and be respectful. That doesn't mean you can't challenge people's behavior. It's not going to be one conversation. It may cause a few rifts, even if you do it respectfully. But it comes back to that verse in Surah An-Nisa. You have to stand up, witnesses for Allah, right? Against yourselves or your parents or your relatives. And, when you're feeling that sort of anxiety of, oh, should I challenge them? Should I not? You need to remember the fact that if they're bringing forward anti-Black statements, racist statements towards the Black community, and even in general, but obviously the focus now is the Black community, right? Anti-Blackness and racism towards them. I need to make sure that I don't let this go, because it's my responsibility. We're instructed to do this. And there's another hadith. If somebody if whoever sees an evil or an injustice, let him change it with his hand or with an action. If he can't do that, then let him change it with his tongue. If he can't do that, then let him keep the sentiment in his heart, and that's the weakest level of faith. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us levels of justice which we can try and apply, right? He's given us those levels of justice. If you try and do something physically against it, if you can't do that, speak against it. If you can't do that, keep the sentiment in your heart. And it's very important that you do that, because if you allow yourself to start condoning things, then I feel like you have lost, you've lost your commitment to justice. You've lost that fundamental commitment to our faith. And the last thing just on this bit as well, again, why I'll come back to the fact why it's important to center our solutions around Islam is because when you look at a lot of other movements, they either don't encompass spirituality within their movements, or maybe they do, but to a very small extent, and it's not sort of through our sort of lens. Islam's solutions allow us to take care of our souls, our hearts, and our minds, right? When we're all working on these issues, speaking on these issues, challenging this, that, we always need to come back to the text to root us in justice, to make sure that we're in the right direction. And within that direction that we're being provided, there is, there's loads of sort of guidance in there in terms of how do we take care of ourselves. Remember, for those who have just joined on, I said in the beginning, Allah is Al-Hakam, right? The giver of justice, the judge. Where our actions fail, we need to trust that on the day of judgment, for every single oppressor who has done a wrong, they're going to see it back in exactly the same proportion. Allah says in Surah Al-Zalzala, right? The last two verses, right? Whosoever does an atom's weight of good will see it. Whosoever does an atom's weight of bad will see it. Essentially, will see it on the day of judgment. An atom's weight, that is beyond our conception. We don't even know what an atom looks like. But Allah is so just in His justice that He will give everybody what they deserve. And at times when you feel heavy and it feels like I can't, my commitment to justice, it's not something I can continue on. And particularly for Black Muslims here as well, and Black people wider who feel there's a lot of injustice. Just speaking on this topic, just remember that Allah is going to give everybody what they deserve. Everybody's going to get that. And that is what our activism should be founded on. We need to keep that in the back of our minds so that we are able, to keep that sort of light in our souls and our hearts.
Yes, subhanAllah, that's really, really important advice, Jazakallah khair, because I think not having that spiritual element to the movement makes you very tied to results in this life, and you're not always going to get that. Like if you just look at what's been happening over the last however long, so many people haven't got their justice in this world. That's just the reality. And unfortunately, that's the nature of this world, that you're not always going to be able to do and achieve that level of perfection in this world, because this world by its nature is a place where there is going to be injustice, there is going to be inequality and all of that sort of thing. So that allows us to be grounded. It allows us to not go beyond our limits, like you mentioned.
Exactly.
And remain true to the sort of the foundations of what we want with any movement, which is to stick by our principles and not let our emotions and not let our anger and our frustration, which is justified, sort of drive us off that path.
100%. And I think just to add a few more thoughts, I think this issue is something, people are asking on social media, why are the Muslims not speaking about this? And some people probably are thinking, some of the Muslim community are thinking, why are we being asked to support efforts against police brutality or injustice against Black people? Our faith instructs us to be just, right? This is now to non-believers and believers, and there are still a lot of Black believers who are affected by this issue anyway. We're instructed to do that. So I think it's important to remember the fact that if there's a injustice going on, it's a Muslim issue. If there's injustice going on, it's a Muslim issue, and we should use our principles to be able to rid that from society. Malcolm X, rahimahullah, right? He thought at one point the only way to get rid of racism in American society was for Black people to completely separate off. That's what he thought, right? After he left the Nation of Islam and he went to Mecca and he drank from the same cup as people from all over the world, white people included, he actually said he thinks there's a possibility for non-violent revolution in American society through the spread of Islam. And he said that he thinks Islam is a cure to the race problem, and that it removes the attitude of that white sort of power can bring in that sense. And I think that I'm very convicted in that. I think it's very, very true. If people really, this is to all the Muslims out there who don't fall under Black category, for example, Asian Muslims, Arab Muslims, from all different backgrounds, right? Honestly, like if we truly bring these hadith and these ayat to life and embody them in our character, in our activism, in our community work, in our interactions, I truly think we can really do so much to get rid of this problem and inshallah just push it out of society if we bring those sentiments to life, because the Prophet ﷺ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is what has literally laid out the foundation for us. There are so many guidances there. We just need to embody them in our day-to-day lives. And I think, honestly, that's something, inshallah, I really want to see, whether it be in our ISOCs, whether it be in wider society. I want Muslims to be standing for justice there when there's an injustice. Whether it be in our ISOCs, our masajid. Another thing I'd love to see is the Imam speaking on the minbar, the Jummah khutbah about this issue. Being honest with people, speaking about it, telling them that, anti-Blackness, racism is a sin, we need to stop it, being vocal. And as you know, I'm a vice president of FOSIS. I wouldn't have joined this organization if I didn't think the leadership and the organization was committed to pushing back against this issue and bringing in awareness. And I think, it's going to be a cross-collaborative effort with other organizations, inshallah. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm hopeful, and I think as well, just that I know time's sort of going. I want to just speak on some positive interactions I've had, not to take away from the issue. These positive interactions for me more serve as a beacon of hope that this, I hope, is how our community can look like. It doesn't take away from the issues that I've faced at all and the issues other Black Muslims are facing in the community, right? It's more about, having that sort of standard that, that can be presented, that this is what we're trying to get to, right? So as I said, I'm a revert. So I usually spend Eid, or when I first had my first Eid, I was spending it alone. My family aren't Muslim, so it obviously that's difficult. And I, before I could drive, the closest masjid is an hour away. That's a 10-minute drive. The people that were taking me to the masjid were an Algerian family, and they did it consistently, and they showed me nothing but love and concern. The family that takes me in basically every Eid is an Indian family. They take me in every Eid, and they literally fill my belly up to the brim. For those of you watching know I like to eat. They literally fill my belly with lamb curry up to the brim, right? I also get invited around by a Somali family. I've had a Jamaican family invite me around, and you may just think these are small instances, but for me, especially when I was going through a lot of these negative things, these experiences, and again, this doesn't detract from them, they're still there. These are things that I want to be held up as places I want the whole community to get to, that we're being, literally, Muslims of other cultures literally inviting me into their homes as if I'm family. That's where I want us to get to, and those interactions have served as a beacon of hope for me to say that, these are at least some people who are doing their best to embody, regardless of what I look like and who I am. And I think, again, it just gives that sort of light in the heart. That's something we can sort of try and get to. Another one, I was learning Arabic in Islamic mosque, and there was a old sort of Bengali uncle, and he came over, and wallahi bro, like, he was so happy to see me. And at that time, I had sort of dreadlocks at the time, right? So I used to get stares in mosques, and it used to make me not really want to go in because I knew I'm going to get stared at. People are going to look at me strange or tell me my hair's un-Islamic and things. But he literally saw me, saw how I looked. He didn't care. He just came over to me, and he was so happy to see me. Like, he was like, "You're learning Arabic." He's like, "MashaAllah." He was trying to give me lessons. Wasn't helping too much though, but it was just the sentiment. Like, it just made me feel like I really do hope this issue can change, and I hope these interactions can be what we see in the wider community. And the last thing I'll say for now, I don't know if you're going to have any more questions or anything, is that please, to everybody watching, we need to take action, because there's a lot of upset, there's a lot of pain, sincere pain and upset. Even though you may not like how it's being portrayed and how it's being put forward, the sentiment behind it is one of sincerity, and that people are tired. People, I want us to be united as an ummah, but it really means that for those who aren't Black, or who, in other ethnicities or groups, say Asian, Arab, wider groups, please really just look at this as an issue that's affecting people, and we need to change. And Allah has set that standard of what we should be reaching there. We just need to embody it if we want to solve this issue, because it is causing pain and anguish. So yeah.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. I think you've also mentioned some ways in which we can take that action. Like, we can each be that beacon of hope for that brother who's come to the mosque and he's getting stares at everyone. You can go and give him salam, make him feel like he's welcome in that masjid, or
trust me,
look at the river. This is such a massive, like that issue that you mentioned about river. This is such a massive problem we have, where people enter Islam, they come to the front of the masjid and they're celebrated for so like enthusiastically for a couple of minutes, and then often very quickly forgotten about. So each one of us has that obligation, that responsibility to make sure that we're taking those actions individually. We had a question. I think we'll only really have time for one or two. But a question from someone who asked, as people of color and Muslims, we have suffered often the same types of discrimination and racism, and we agree it's not the same extent as Black people often face. But I feel like I would be taking the spotlight from Black people. What would you advise? How should non-Black Muslims of color navigate how they speak on this, showing they understand without taking away from? the current situation?
I think it's a good question. I think when Black Muslims or Black people are speaking on this issue, just actively listen. I think just actively listen. I think that's the first step, and educate yourself. There's a lot of resources. FOSIS posted some resources. If you go on our social media pages, you'll find resources that can help sort of educate you on this issue. Documentaries, books. There's a report by the Black Muslim Forum as well, done on 100 Black Muslims in the UK. Educate yourself and sensitize yourself. You're not always going to get the reaction right. And I don't think you should 100% be expected to do that. But I think it's just having that inward commitment to want to change. I think even, I think it was said that they haven't suffered to the same extent. I'm not here to say that one group has suffered more than another. When we look at some of the statistics, for example, and these are not always statistics that really apply to any other community, as a Black person, you are, I think, 50% more likely to be sectioned under the Mental Health Act, which basically means that if you go to the GP as a Black person suffering from mental health issues, you're 50% more likely to be seen as being prone to being violent to yourself. And so when you go to the GP, you're 50% more likely to basically be forcefully detained by police and put in a psychiatric facility. And I've seen this happen to people in the community, by the way, people close to me. It's not an exaggeration, and there's other things. For example, in the UK, people say that there's a stat that basically says that in London, Black people are 4 times more likely than their white counterparts to be stopped and searched. Again, people from other communities don't tend to see that. In other parts of the country, for example, if you go down to Devon, sort of Cornwall area, it's up to 17 times more likely. And just you said something way before that I didn't address, where people say that racism in the UK is better than the US, right? I would disagree with that because there's, for example, there's someone called Adrian McDonald in 2014. He was seriously bitten by police. By a police dog.
Did you say bitten? Oh, okay.
He was bitten by a police dog, seriously bitten, and he was tased. And his last words in 2014 in Staffordshire were the same: "I can't breathe." Right? But people don't always hear about this. There's so many more stories. So many more stories. You tell someone like that it's not as bad, right? It's not as bad as it is in the US. They're gonna, the family of Adrian McDonald will very much disagree with you. Coming back to the point that was said before, so it's not, I don't want to say it's about extent. You don't suffer it to the same extent. People will experience suffering in different ways, right? But when you look at the statistics, it does show that typically Black people are more discriminated against by power structures and systems. But it's not an oppression Olympics. It's not about who suffered more, because I know within Arab communities and Asian communities, there are disproportionate amounts of stop and search and violence and different things to them as well, and discrimination. I know, about the sort of, I think I don't know if it was a National Front or a racist group that came through the Whitechapel area and attacked the Bengali community. Yeah, this has happened a few times over the last few decades. So I know there's issues. I think we can definitely find parts of solidarity there, but when, for example, Black community is talking, I think just listen, and then let them speak, and then maybe after we can speak about, how can we bring our struggles together? How can we speak about this? If you have people around you, try and engage in some polite discussion with them if you can. If you also want to send me an email, please feel free to do so as well, because this is part of my work. This is something I'm quite passionate about as well. And I think at the end of the day, once we've listened to each other, we come up with solutions, and then we do it in a way that's united. There's a verse, Surah Al-Tawbah, verse 71. The believing men and the believing women are allies of each other. They enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. That is so key. We're actually allies of each other, and we should behave in that way as well. So,
Jazakallah khair. I think this whole last hour has been an exercise in that, exercise in really just understanding the issue, listening, and trying to figure out where we go from here. It's not always the time to talk, and often we just need to take a step back and sort of take stock of where we are. So Jazakallah khair, Akhi Ayo, for your time. It's been a really, really interesting and beneficial experience. Inshallah, everyone watching has learned a lot about sort of the current situation and what we personally can do to make this better, inshallah. Just the last couple of things from me before we end, inshallah. So For those of you who aren't familiar with the Muslim Youth Network, MYN is a youth organization which is run by youth for the youth, and we envision a community of a generation of Muslim youth who are inspired by the revelation and grounded in the reality of racism, the reality of the problems that we face all around us, and that we have the courage and the resolve to make a difference, that we have the courage and resolve to act on this individually and collectively, and make a difference, inshallah. If you want to find out more about us, you can visit our website, muslimyouthnetwork.com, or follow us on social media. I think most of our social media is MYN_UK. So jazakumullah khairan everyone, and to Ayo specifically for joining us today. And inshallah we'll be back next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.